Thank you for joining us for the fourth episode in the RF Breakthrough Series. I'm Greg Johnson, Director of Place-Based Innovation on the Equity and Economic Opportunity team at the Rockefeller Foundation. The fourth episode in the live stream RF Breakthrough Series is titled Changing the Landscape Through Access to Capital. Small businesses are struggling to recover from COVID-19, and Black and Latino-owned businesses are among the hardest hit. Further complicating the recovery for these businesses is the fact that they typically have the hardest time gaining access to capital. Literally, landscapes will be changed and communities left struggling unless avenues and methods for increasing access to capital are embraced. Directing investment into BIPoC small businesses and creating new types of catalytic risk capital are key to meeting the needs of communities for economic recovery and racial justice. That's why in June, the foundation launched the Rockefeller Foundation Opportunity Collective, a $10 million commitment to 10 places across the country aimed at eliminating the barriers to capital access and credit for Black and Latinx and Native and low-wage entrepreneurs across the country. If we get this right, we can unlock 1.1 million new businesses, 9 million new jobs, and $3 billion will boost our national economy. Today's panelists are working to develop a deeper, a faster commitment to those who've been excluded from the system and hit hardest by the pandemic. We have brought together a range of actors to unpack innovative initiatives that chart the course from where we are to where we need and want to be for audacious investors, financial and business service providers, and BIPoC entrepreneurs. Joining me to discuss are Melissa Bradley, founder and managing partner at 1863 Ventures, Nancy Santiago Negron, Vice President at Hispanics in Philanthropy, Spencer Overton, President at the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, and unfortunately, Dr. Lakeisha Hallman, CEO and founder of the Village Market in ATL, is unable to join us today. She shares her regrets, and we look forward to future opportunities to connect with her and to share her best advice in the future. Spencer, I'd like to cue you up first. The beginning is often a good place to start. And for those of us who are designing policy and practice solutions to the types of issues that we surfaced in the introduction, the ability to turn hindsight into foresight becomes critical. Can you help us to better understand how we got to where we are with the state of BIPoC small businesses and why that history is critical to informing the solutions in this current moment?
Sure, Greg, I first have to recognize you for your vision. Your colleagues need to know that your work at Rockefeller is getting attention, not just from CDFIs and MDIs and businesses of color, but also from community organizers, policymakers, and the private sector. You know communities of color and their needs. You understand traditional structures that have not been designed to address these needs, and you connect the dots and you see the big picture. So keep doing what you're doing. I also want to thank Lisa Mensah and Defina Williams at the Opportunity Finance Network. They've been critical partners with the Joint Center in this work. Now, from a historical standpoint, before the pandemic, Black, Native, and Latinx small businesses were growing, but they were generally more fragile and less profitable than white-owned businesses. So, for example, before the pandemic, just 7 types of relatively low-revenue business types accounted for 54% of Black businesses and 33% of Latino businesses, including beauty salons and barbershops, janitorial services, home health care, child care, landscaping. This is in large part due to a lack of access to capital for business owners of color to get into higher revenue industries, which stems in part from racial wealth disparities. So, we all know that, for example, white households have about 10 times the amount of wealth as Black households and about 7 times the amount of Latino households. But this is not just about disparities in skills or education. One study found that the typical household headed by a white person without a high school diploma has more wealth than the typical household headed by an African American with a college degree. Now, this current pandemic, it's a national emergency for everybody, but particularly small business owners of color. Black, Native, and Latinx displacement and unemployment rates have been higher. More families living paycheck to paycheck. And more of these businesses have been less likely to be able to access support from the Paycheck Protection Program and other programs. That's in part because CDFIs were not fully included as lenders in the first round of PPP funding. That first round was focused on lenders that give out larger loans. Now, all of this illustrates a snowballing problem. Systems that are not designed to address the needs of communities of color. If we look back, for example, at the GI Bill, it was facially race neutral. It was supposed to lift all boats, but in fact, it expanded already existing racial disparities because Black vets weren't able to take advantage of the GI Bill's mortgage guarantees, college tuition benefits because of racially restrictive covenants, redlining, educational segregation, right? So all of this, there's been kind of this intergenerational transfer of wealth, and this still affects us today, and failures of contemporary programs like PPP continue to expand these disparities. So we've seen the impact of the data. Robert Fairley, the economist, talks about the fact that the number of active Black business owners dropped 19% between February and June of this year. That's 4 times higher than the decline of white business owners. Now, the decline of active Latinx owners was twice as high as that of white business owners. Now, those numbers are a little different than the numbers on the slide because the numbers on the slide were from February to April. There was a bit of a rebound by June because more businesses opened up, but the disparities actually increased. So Black business declines were twice as high as white business declines by April 2020, but they were 4 times as high by June 2020 because white businesses recovered faster.
Wow, thank you so much for helping us to understand that the poverty that exists in Black and Native and Latino communities is the intentional consequence of conscious policies, and that the systems that were put in place by those policies continue to enact harm on those communities and inhibit their ability to create wealth for themselves, their families, and their communities. Nancy, I'm coming to you because Spencer talked about these systems, and we're talking about the financial services system and the business services system and the impact that that's having on Black and Latinx and Native families right now. I wonder if you could also broaden this conversation a little bit, though, to talk about the other intersectional dangers or barriers that are preventing these very communities or populations of people from, again, being able to create wealth for themselves, their families, and their communities.
Sure, and thank you very much for having this discussion. As Spencer mentioned, we're talking about a system that was fractured and broken long before the pandemic. And I liken it to the fact that the pandemic just revealed the vulnerabilities. It also revealed what we choose to invest in as a society. Liking it to, say, Puerto Rico. After Hurricane Maria, people thought the hurricane caused all the damage. That was not all the damage. The fractured system was there long before the hurricane hit. What we got to see was the revelation of what systemic inequity and disinvestment looks like. So for us, I think it's really important. I start with this quote that has become gospel to me. And the quote basically says that credit is a financial transaction with a moral lineage. Because you really only invest in people if you believe they have a future. So what we need to be paying attention to is what didn't we invest in? The pandemic revealed to us what we haven't paid attention to, what we haven't invested in. And when you start to think about the fractured system and how that left us much more vulnerable, think about the fact that the majority of Black and brown business owners had fewer than 14 days cash buffer before the pandemic hit. And so now we're looking at month 9. What does that mean for the survival rate of our businesses? We know the data is telling us that 50% of Black-owned businesses won't come back. Over 30% of Latino-owned businesses won't come back. But for those of us that are working on the ground, seeing the impact of this in communities, we're looking at much scarier numbers. New York City now. We're looking at 75% of Latino-owned businesses in places like Chicago not coming back. And the business sector or our small businesses and SMBs are only one part of this equation. The other really important part to talk about is philanthropy. It's so important that you're having this conversation. I cannot thank you enough for pushing this issue in such a bold way. Thank you to Rockefeller, and thank you, Greg, for your leadership on this. But it's really important for us to talk about the role philanthropy plays and hasn't played in some of the investments needed in our community. We know that organizations that are led by people of color receive less grant dollars and are trusted less to make decisions about the futures of their communities. And there's also an example of just the disinvestment or the lack of investment. For interest in the Latino community, philanthropic giving has hovered at 1.3% for over a decade. Philanthropic dollars going to Latino-led organizations is at 1.3% and has been there for a decade. Yet the population has now grown to 18.1% of the US population. So those are the disparities that are growing and causing much of the pain we're seeing in communities that are being built upon already a broken foundation. I would also say that there's an important piece to think about this. How do philanthropic organizations that claim to be working on racial equity issues really work on them when the funding is crippling impact and outcomes? When you think about the fact that 92% of philanthropic organizations are led by white people and 83% of their full-time staff are white people, how are you truly getting at issues of racial equity and really building the capacity of our community to lead for ourselves? I think the most important thing I want to say in all of this is stop to philanthropy. Stop forcing people of color to prove that we are worthy of your investment.
Wow, so much to unpack there. So much to unpack there, from making morally centered decisions and policies and practices to literally investing in the ability of Black and Latinx people, but Black and Latinx small business owners to become the architects of public policies that impact their lives rather than simply the objects of it. Melissa, I want to come to you. I want to give you an opportunity to kind of respond to the context of where Black and Latinx and Native small businesses currently are, but I also want to talk to you about setting the table stakes for why, despite the historical lack of investment, despite all of the barriers that Black, Latinx, and Native people continue to experience in accessing capital, why we must invest in them and why they are critical to building an inclusive economy in any community, but also across the country. So can you talk to us a little bit about what the table stakes are and begin to have the conversation with us about what we need to do to protect what's on the table and to expand the table at the same time?
Sure. Well, let me just first say thank you for having me, and let me echo both Spencer and Nancy for thanking you for this important conversation. I'm sure all of us on this call can attest to the fact that our phones ring off the hook post George Floyd, and it's a shame that that's even a demarcation of time with people asking these kinds of questions individually. So the opportunity to share with these amazing panelists who I am proud to call friends is a tremendous honor. To set the table a little bit and respond, but also talk about what is lost. I think we have to understand that these are not just statistics that we should say, oh, woe is me, or that's too bad, or maybe their time will come. I think we have to recognize that there is not just a racist structural system that is holding us back, that has a moral consequence, but there is an economic consequence to not being able to support Black entrepreneurs. You shared earlier the statistics around what is lost when we do not invest in Black and Latinx. We know that there was the same investment of Black businesses as there are on white businesses. We could actually produce an estimated 9 million more jobs and boost our national income by at least $300 billion. That's not chump change. We also know that because there has been this lack of disinvestment, or lack of investment, I should say, in Black businesses, there has been a ripple effect in terms of our ability to care for our families, to care for our communities, to help bridge the gap around issues of education. And so it is not just a bad thing because it's exhibiting racism. It's a bad thing because it's actually costing this country a tremendous amount of money. Citi just did the report that it's an estimate of $16 trillion is the cost that racism has on our country. That is exacerbated from a macro level to a micro level when we know, based on research that I had the privilege to do at Georgetown, it cost a Black entrepreneur $250,000 more to start the same exact business as their white peer. So what does that mean? Well, it means that, one, I'm missing out on opportunity. That when I go to the table and ask for money and banks refuse to lend to me, or in some cases we know charge Black entrepreneurs anywhere between 1.5 to 2 percentage points more, it's because we're lacking the equity and access to capital that our white peers have. And that is totally because of historical racism and being locked out of home ownership and being locked out of educational opportunity. But if we are not allowed to contribute, as Black and brown folks literally are the new majority in many states and will be the new majority of this country, the economic crisis that will only be exacerbated because we are not able to fulfill what our promise, what our potential is in our contribution to this country. There's another statistic that I just want to touch on briefly, and that is the fact that when we think about what we could be contributing, we have to remember that it's not just what we contribute to our communities, which is extremely important, but African Americans have been responsible consistently for 10% more, or 10% and above, of annual GDP year over year. And so while we have transitioned as an asset that oftentimes was owned by slave plantation owners, that we recall that in Mississippi there was a bond that was securitized by African American slaves. Our value has always been recognized by this country, but it has been submersed and not allowed to recognize its potential because it was fearful or leveraged just for the white community. This is a unique opportunity when we think about the job creation and the economic potential that Black and Latinx entrepreneurs can create, to really rethink how we invest in them, how we support them from an ecosystem perspective, and certainly how we create policies to be able to advance that opportunity. Having served in the Clinton administration, the role of just something as simple as the Community Reinvestment Act, which has yet to be reauthorized and certainly is not being enforced, played a tremendous role of unlocking capital in low income and marginalized communities, of which we now see have tremendous trade value, have amazing housing stock, and whose average income of Black, brown, and their white communities have increased because there's been an investment in those communities that have been overlooked and underserved. So I think the biggest takeaway of what we've heard from amazing statistics from Spencer and certainly from Nancy is that there is indeed a moral crisis in terms of how people of color have been marginalized. But there is an even greater economic crisis if this continued disinvestment allows people to not understand that the greatest economic contribution has been from Black entrepreneurs, particularly Black women, who are creating businesses 6 times faster than their white male peers. And dare I say, if we can start from negative 250 and create $1 million businesses, what a lost opportunity for this country to maintain its economic power and, more importantly, stability in light of this COVID crisis.
Wow, phenomenal. So much potential. And we've got to think about how we actually turn that potential into a real thing, right? So Nancy, I'm coming back to you to talk about what we need to do differently in this space, right? What are the innovations? What are the solutions that are needed? So our programming with the Rockefeller Foundation's Opportunity Collective looks at 3 different things. One of the things that we want to do are to help Black and Native and Latinx small and micro business owners build political power and coalition in their places to hold local officials accountable. And I'm coming back to Spencer to talk a little bit more about that and what information we need to know next. But one of the other pillars of our work is around this issue of contextual technical assistance in order to help these Black, Latinx, and Native micro and small businesses have a higher degree of capital readiness, right? So I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about the types of innovations that you're seeing and the types of innovations that are necessary to make sure that this potential becomes a real thing to the benefit of families and communities.
Sure. I will say, I think I want to unpack just a little bit before I start, is to say that the same things that keep our community from capital in the business sector is the same thing that happens to us in the philanthropic sector, right? And there are 4 key barriers to that access. It's about being connected, and the leaders of color are not getting equitable access to enable them to get to the sources of dollars, be they private philanthropic or otherwise. There's the opportunities that we are missing to build the kind of rapport that's needed to build the trust, to keep coming back together. So it's not just a one-time investment, but you're talking about investment strategy. We also need to be able to secure support. Funders often lack the cultural understanding of what it takes to move things in our communities. And finally, the sustained relationship building that is required, not just as we start to build and collaborate and invest together, but then what is the succession plan? How will our organizations that provide access to capital look different in 5 years than they do right now? So I think that when we start to talk about that, and we start to talk about the importance of not decoupling the financial support or the capital, financial capital, from the social capital that is needed to be successful in this country. This myth that you're successful based on your individual skill or bravado or what you've built for yourself, it's a big myth, right? It's the picture of the Marlboro man out on some farm in the middle of nowhere, lifting himself up by his bootstraps, when we know darn well that it is the network around us that make us successful or not. It is the network and system that's there to support our business community and our organizations in our communities that lead us to a level of access that we don't currently have. So I think it's really important to start with that idea. We need to get rid of this myth that we build ourselves up on our own. This whole idea of individualism, that's not how it works. Real success for business and for nonprofits is happening around these networks. So one of the innovations that we talk about all the time is not decoupling those sources of support, and it's building opportunities, platforms like Eureka, opportunities like the Power Up Fund, to bring the expertise, the mentors, the coaches that understand one piece of this system, to the entrepreneurs that need the support, to then the philanthropic community to come in with the back end support to make sure we can take greater risks in communities around investments. That risk capital is something that the philanthropic community has not unlocked yet to date. And that's the biggest role that I think that organizations like Rockefeller play. And that's what this effort is going to build for us. Not just the capacity and extending the networks, but allowing us to take greater risks, which allow us to innovate. We cannot innovate without room. And we have no room right now. Post-pandemic, we are all struggling.
Wow. I'm going to leave on the table for a different conversation, dismantling the myths that enable meritocracy. We'll have to have an entire separate convening to deal with that one, but definitely take your point about providing the necessary catalytic risk capital to these communities, right? And happy that the foundation is taking a leadership role in bringing along some of our philanthropic partners, as well as private investors in this space. Spencer, I want to come back to you, but before I queue up these last few questions with Spencer and the rest of the panel, those of you who are tuning in from all across the country, all across the globe, there is an opportunity for you to join this conversation. You can submit your questions. We're going to begin answering those really soon. So if you are tuned in on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on Facebook, however you are joining us today on YouTube, please submit your questions. We're going to get to those in just a few minutes. But before we do that, Spencer, I wanted to come back to you to talk a little bit about what information we still need to gather or to develop to be able to serve this population better, to serve them in a way that actually is accountable to their needs and interests, but also provides the specific technical assistance and support that enables them to overcome the barriers that we've talked about being in their way. I wonder if you could help us to just better understand what we don't know, and maybe how the Joint Center and some of our other partners are going to help us to figure it out and fill those gaps.
Sure, I'll definitely do that. I want to take a quick step back here, Greg. Before I talked about the GI Bill and mortgages, these are people who are maybe our grandparents or other folks that we can relate to. Some of us have a difficulty going back farther than that. And as a lawyer, I've always thought about race as related to rights and justice. But if we're just frank about this, we've got to recognize that race was primarily something that was economic and used to expand our economy. We're talking about wealth and business, and that is how it was used. Slavery, Jim Crow, Bracero programs, they were fundamentally efforts to maintain a cheap labor supply. So, immediately after the ratification of the Constitution, the nation used slavery to undercut China and India to quickly become a global economic superpower. Cotton produced by enslaved persons constituted over half of American exports for the first 6 decades of the 1800s. Conquest and the treaties of Paris and Guadalupe Hidalgo had racial overtones and had a similar boost to the national economy. Now, if we ignore these factors, and if we continue the disinvestment with regard to communities and businesses of color, and we just simply say, "Oh, we're not paying attention to race," and we're designing systems that don't benefit Black and Latinx businesses, just markets aren't fair. And so I just think it's important for us to take a look at this from an economic standpoint, not like economics or race, but recognizing that our economy is fundamentally based in some racial assumptions and rules and that kind of thing. Now, in terms of research questions, we need a better understanding of the financing mechanisms that'll better meet the needs of people of color who are in business. So right now, there's a lack of standardized data about the small business lending market, especially with regard to differences in race, geography, gender, type of loan product, providers, and pricing of credit. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is supposed to be collecting this data from financial institutions, but implementation of that has been delayed. As a result of the support of Rockefeller, which is appreciated, the Joint Center is doing a survey of over 5,000 small business owners, evenly divided among Black, Latinx, Asian American, and white business owners. We're focused on the 10 localities you mentioned earlier, Greg. The project is particularly complex because national survey firms can't provide business owners of color. So even though a polling firm like Nielsen has a panel of over 200,000 respondents across the nation, they could not provide more than 400 Black business owners nationwide as respondents. As a result, we're working with business chambers of colors to obtain about 150 responses from business owners in each racial group in each of the localities that you mentioned earlier. Our survey is designed to get a better understanding of the types of capital businesses of color need to start, stabilize, and grow businesses. We need more data, for example, on who do Black and Latinx businesses trust to give them access to capital? What kind of access do they have to flexible capital, microloans, and early stage equity funding? Who do they feel has been most successful in helping them with technical assistance? What have been their biggest problems under COVID? How much of a voice do business owners of color feel like they have in the policymaking process? We also need a more refined understanding of the shortcomings and strengths of the PPP program and how it affected different types of businesses of color here. And so those are some of the issues. And then also, what are the differences, the racial differences? And then also, how do things differ from locality to locality?
Awesome. Thank you so much. The more we know, it can inform our path forward so that we get this right. Melissa, I'm going to come to you with the last question before we go to the Q&A that's been sent in literally from around the world across different platforms. But I want to come to you to talk a little bit more specifically about the types of catalytic capital that are necessary. The Rockefeller Foundation's Opportunity Collective will be supporting a number of different types of recoverable grants, prize competitions, competitive grant dollars, revenue-based financing, trust-based financing, right? All of those things are important. I also wonder if you could weave in, I'm just throwing the kitchen sink at you right now, weave in a little bit of the conversation around the challenges with credit and FICO algorithms and the like, which is why innovative practices like trust-based lending are going to be important tools in the toolbox of how we move from where we are to where we need and want to be. So I'm going to pass that question to you. And once Melissa has responded to this question, we're going to begin to field some questions that have come in from our friends on the web.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I think first, let me start with the credit score piece, because Nancy teed this concept up. We all have not just our name and our demographic identity, our racial identity, but we have a financial identity that is unfortunately not determined by us, but determined by FICO scores or what we call Fair Isaac credit or credit scores. And the reality is that, the history of credit scores, which started in 1841, was really created by a bunch of mercantiles who didn't use it to determine your creditworthiness, but used it as a way to enforce or reinforce racial, class, and gender biases in the merchant trade, and to make sure that Black businesses and other businesses that were non-white were actually excluded from having access to capital to be able to grow their businesses in response to demand. And so that unfortunately has continued. I'm happy to say that there's at least some momentum, since I'm based here in DC, to talk about something around alternative credit scores. What's important to recognize is that despite all the numbers that we've just talked about and the disparities that exist within the Black and brown communities, one, we are extremely resilient. I do not want people to walk away from this and say, woe is me. The fact that we have made it this far, and the strides and the breakthroughs that we've made around venture capital, around entrepreneurship, around job creation, around education, are just the tip of the iceberg of the contributions that we can be making. But the continued systemic barriers like credit scores hold us back and suppress the potential for ourselves and for this country. So when we think about current credit scores, they look at things like home ownership. And as Spencer mentioned, because the GI Bill, which was a structural policy, it actually did not translate well for Black Americans. And I can only imagine how it didn't translate well for Latinx community. And so we have been locked out of home ownership for years. However, if you were to ask any Black person that you may know, while we may not have a mortgage and we're renting, we manage the little bit of money we have to prioritize what is important to us, and we should not be penalized because of that. And so within the alternative credit score, the idea is that you look at other ways that we pay. You look at our rent, utility, cable, cell phone bills. You look at checking account data, because we have checking accounts. We may not always have expansive savings accounts. You look at shopping history. You look at property records. Some people have gone so far as to say, look at social media and those kind of things. But there are plenty of ways to determine a person's character and to be able to underwrite their ability to repay a loan beyond this standard kind of emblem of what is wealth in this country, when indeed we have wealth. It's just not, unfortunately, at the same level. So I think that's the first start, right? To recognize that the ability to unlock any capital at all means that we have to overturn the current structure that says you are credit worthy. Because we are creditworthy, and we need to be able to shift and change what our financial identity is saying about us. And let me be really clear about something before I actually answer the question, and that is that 54% of all adults in this country have super prime and prime credit scores. This means a significant portion have less than ideal credit scores, and 22% have no credit at all. And that's not just Black and brown folks, that's everybody. So this is not just a problem for our communities, but universal. With that said, I think it's important for us to understand that the current structures that exist are very limiting. The lack of innovation in financial services has really been a challenge for everyone. And so when you think about debt, this is where this credit course comes in, because we repay. If you think about all of the predatory relationships that Black and brown communities enter into, we oftentimes are paying way more than what we need to, but we're paying them back. There's a woman in Chicago who was running a business, and she had taken an SBA loan, and then she had a couple of predatory loans, and she said, I just can't get ahead. My cash flow remains consistent. And I said, because you're spending almost 22% in debt service. Imagine if we could reduce that debt service, how significant that would be on your cash flow. So we need to recognize that it can't always be just term loans, particularly those in cyclical businesses. We need to look at revenue-based financing or royalty-based financing, where it's based on a fixed percentage of your revenue each month, so that we don't push you out of business, but we allow you to still repay with probably a similar term or maybe slightly longer, but allow you to reinvest some of those dollars into your business. Project Diane just released their report on equity. And we now know that there are actually more Black female entrepreneurs who received equity, but we have only moved from 0.1% to 0.2%. And so we have to recognize that going after this Shark Tank mentality is not going to serve us well. And so we've seen a tremendous growth in crowdfunding platforms that are no longer just grant-based, but equity-based or lending-based. We have seen many institutions come up with other creative ways and many new funds post-George Floyd that have come onto the scene to say equity and debt are not the only ways to advance a business. We need to begin to align financial products with the types of businesses that exist. And dare I say that we know, based on a McKinsey report and probably all through common sense, many of the Black businesses are B2C businesses. They're selling to consumers. Are there ways that we can deliver different types of credit and different types of financial products that allow them to survive and that are much more in tune with their cash flow as opposed to some false predetermined amount of what we think you need to pay every single month?
Right. Melissa, I'm going to stick with you as we go into our questions from our partners, from the good people out in the web. This question comes from Bill Taft. And I'm going to ask you this because it kind of fits in with what you were just saying. What are the greatest technical assistance gaps that must be addressed to prepare BIPoC small businesses to successfully access credit?
Well, first of all, Bill, thank you for that question. I was just on a panel the other day, amazingly, with Carla Harris from Morgan Stanley, and we were actually talking about this very issue. I think there's a couple of things. I think one is that I have the privilege and have the privilege to be a finance major, because in this country, 2 + 2 will always be 4, and 3 × 3 will always be 9. American history will continuously be rewritten depending on who's in that Oval Office. And we know many other sectors do not have that level of stability. So the first thing I would say is we have to change our mindsets and really become comfortable with the fact that we need to really understand our finances. We have to understand that our focus and our time and our attention on financial statements and cash flow management is extremely important. The other piece, though, is not just the statements, because the statements are really just a reflection of our values. We have to get comfortable that we deserve to get paid. And one of the challenges that I find in businesses getting access to credit is that we underestimate the value of our business because we are so busy trying to survive that we're running to the store and buying this in our personal credit card. We're forgoing our salary because we really want to be committed to the community. And while we still may not get paid, we need to demonstrate that and put that in financial statements, whether it's salary payable or draw payable, so that people understand what is the cost of actually running a business, so that when somebody on the other side of that table trying to make a loan or trying to make an investment can see that, one, we understand what it takes to run that business, but two, we understand the right amount of investment that needs to go in to allow those businesses to grow. So one, is really having financial capacity. The second thing that I just will say, I think it's been really prevalent in COVID, is understanding your customers is not just something that you do at the beginning of the business. It is a consistent process of being in touch with your customers, of checking in with them, of understanding their needs, and being able to be responsive when, whether mass pandemics happen or a market shift changes. And that then I would just couple with digital literacy. When many of these businesses that were brick and mortar had to move online, there was lost time of them understanding how to manipulate these social media algorithms. And they can be manipulated. You don't just pop up on the top of a search because your business starts with A anymore. And so those are the three things that I would say: really getting comfort and confidence in our financials and being able to articulate that those statements are nothing but an amplification of our story and our values. And as Black and brown folks, we have very strong values. And it is getting access to the right type of technical assistance that includes coaching, that includes focusing on customers, and helps us transition to digital skills, which unfortunately are already locked out because of the digital divide, that we need to now be able to be successful in this online e-commerce world.
Awesome. I want to move to Nancy. Nancy, we have a question that comes in from Jeffrey. Jeffrey wants to know that given that virtually none of the 3.5 million immigrant businesses and 7 million minority businesses have received assistance through PPP, EIDL, or like programs, how is it possible to reach these businesses, given that these businesses, except for a few exceptions, lack the business relationships with bank, the credit scores, as Melissa talked about previously, collateral, and sometimes even legal immigration statuses. Yet these businesses have historically been financed through loans from friends and family and immigrant community saving circles. How do these communities and populations of small business owners use social capital to benefit themselves in this space?
Yeah, no, thank you so much for the question, Jeff. And I would say social capital is something that Latinos know really well, right? It's a whole study on this idea of personalismo. It is what we do. The problem is it doesn't translate into this society as well, right? When you get to the mainland, when you get to the US. And so part of what we need to be thinking about is how do we, as institutions that are advocating or helping our financial sector really rethink how they best serve these communities, what are some of the policy changes that are needed? But then what are also some of the skill sets that already exist in the community or systems that already exist that we can tap into? So I would say you're absolutely right on the fact that immigrant communities either didn't partake or couldn't partake in some of the opportunities that were offered in the early stages of kind of the rolling out of government support. And that really caused a real problem in our community, not just for being able to access the capital, but also this fear that sets in, right? We're living in a climate that doesn't make it particularly easy for immigrants to come forward and say, I need some help. But I do think that there's some things that we can offer. So we should be thinking about things like the expanded use of ITINs, right? How do policy changes for banks and credit unions translate into them being able to use ITINs safely? Because if you're going to create an increased risk for banks and other lenders, they're not going to be using it, right? So we can be using ITIN numbers if we create the right penalties, take away some of the penalties and create the right policies to support banks and other responsible lenders in using this safely and soundly. We can also be thinking about the role that foundations and corporations are playing. Together, they can be coming together to help build credit enhancement tools. Think about a fund that uses reserves to support participating lenders. Think about the opportunities that we have to use things like the EB-5 program, the fees that are collected from the EB-5 program, to create investment opportunities so that we can continue to invest in other immigrants, be they documented or not. Because part of the problem that CDFIs face and some of our other really responsible partners in communities is that their dollars often are commingled. And the federal government has said that you can't use certain dollars to support undocumented immigrants. Yet we know these immigrants are in our communities, starting businesses and adding to the value of our communities at whole, and adding jobs and adding basically money to flow into our local economies. So what can we be doing to create funds that allow groups like CDFIs to serve this community without a penalty at the federal government level? And then how do we think very uniquely about what are the different tools that immigrant communities need? Yes, they go to families more. Yes, they're engaged in kind of these social giving circles. But the truth of the matter is that organizations like Hispanics in Philanthropy have the flexibility because it is philanthropic money that we can leverage to create new financial tools, new opportunities that are not beholden to the federal government and whatever policies come into play for a particular administration around who you can or cannot.
Awesome. Looks like Spencer wants to jump in there, so I'm going to allow him to add on, but I'm going to give him a question to answer after he's been able to respond to Nancy if he wants to add anything there. Spencer, we talked about the need to develop coalition among small business owners, right? So that they develop power being defined as the ability to make something happen or not in their own interest. We talked about the need to provide contextualized business services and TA for these small business owners to make sure that they have a higher degree of capital readiness. And we talked about the types of innovation that are needed in the capital services and market opportunity space, right, to ensure that there is capital on the other side of this readiness conundrum that we're also helping to solve. I wonder, and this question comes in from Amy Murdoch. The question is what are the ideal metrics for measuring a community's effort to increase access to capital? So what should we be measuring to know whether or not we're making a difference in this space?
Well, first of all, I don't think I could ever improve on a response by Nancy and Melissa here, right? I just kind of defer to them here. And So I think Amy has an important question here. And first thing, kind of circling back, we've got to have this data, Greg. I mean, we need the CFPB to implement the section of Dodd-Frank that requires financial institutions to collect certain data regarding applications for credit for women-owned, minority-owned, and small businesses. And we need to report that data annually. You know, we need them to report that data annually to the CFPB, right? So once we get that consistent data, we'll be smarter about which metrics we should focus on, which metrics tell us the most, and we'll be able to develop targeted solutions that address systemic challenges to access to capital. Second, I think that the question of which metrics to track depends on what community we're talking about. If we're talking about geographic communities, it's important to assess who are the lenders in local markets. Is the local community well served by banks and mainstream institutions? Are there a lot of CDFIs? Or is it mostly online or payday type lenders? If the community is lenders, I think some metrics involve the volumes of loans being extended to small business owners of color, the type of loan product, the pricing, right? If the community is small business owners of color, I think some key metrics involve access to capital, including specific types of capital, and also longitudinal data on the characteristics of their businesses, including revenues, number of employees and contractors, and the industries, specific industries that they're in. If the community is philanthropy, I agree that a local focus is important, and that focus needs to dig into these data points above with all these other communities to really assess whether philanthropic efforts are moving the needle.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Spencer. I'm going to allow each of you in a few minutes an opportunity to offer a call to action to a different community of people. But before we get there, we have a couple of more questions that are coming in from our panelists. And so I want to go to Nancy with this question, who comes from David. And David asks a very simple question, Nancy. He says, how do you reach BIPoC entrepreneurs, Black, Native, Latinx entrepreneurs who are being crushed by the barriers and circumstances that they are facing? And that's stopping a lot of startups from getting going.
It's so interesting because the reality is, how do you reach the entrepreneur? You have to be in their spaces, right? We cannot reach out to people from on high and think that we're going to get the masses. If COVID has taught us nothing else, it's that where we're doing our work is not limited by our office space. We keep expecting people to come to us, and the reality is we need to be where they are. I look at banks that have been extremely successful at lending in communities of color, and there's a whole bunch of things that they do. But one of the things that I find most interesting is that their folks are very rarely in their offices, and they're in the communities. And they have branches in places like churches, or I don't know if I'm going to mention a bank here, but I am going to holler at one of them that I saw doing not such great things 8 years ago, and now being top of the heap when it comes to how well you serve communities. It's places like Wood Forest, right? They're in every Walmart that they lend in any community. They're in a Walmart. Well, think about what that is. They're going to the community. So the number one way is how you find them. You got to be where they are. And I think that we have more of an opportunity to do that now. So many of us are relying on social media. If you know nothing about Latinos, you know we love our social media. So let's figure out how we reach our folks in the circles that we're in right now through the tools and vehicles that we have at our disposal. And I think that what we really need to be thinking about is, how do we push banks and other lenders to hire the best-in-class community development folks that come from our communities, because they know exactly where the entrepreneurs are. But if your staff that's doing the work of your bank or your lending institution around new business or developing community doesn't look like the community they're serving, we have a problem. When you start to invest not just in the staff and the people of a community, but then looking at the minority-owned institutions in that community, focusing in on even things like opportunity zone funding. How much do you know about what's going on there and who the players are? How do you pivot from your model of working, which is kind of broadcasting a message, to truly creating systems that engage community? Because the best way to get to our entrepreneurs are to be in their space and to listen to them. The problem is we don't listen. We have them filling out forms. We're very much a rules-based culture still in business, when the reality is that entrepreneurs of color work in a relationship-based culture. And the faster we can start to understand that and shift from this low context proliferation of signs and rules and contracts to high context messaging, understanding that relationships are born of kind of experience together, the better we get at shifting from this rules-based culture to relationship-based culture, the faster you will get to entrepreneurs of color, because that's where we operate.
Wow. Wow. We don't do enough listening. We do a lot of having people fill out forms. I think that is a critique that carries over across a lot of different parts. I want to ask this last question to Melissa, and Melissa, it comes from good person Stacy in Pennsylvania, and I'll ask if you could answer this really quickly so that we can begin the wrap up. But she wants to know, what initial steps should microlenders take to make effective capital investments to truly help BIPoC businesses build financial and social capital?
So it's really a summary of everything we just talked about. So thank you, Stacey, for the question. I think one is that microlenders need to get out there and actually talk to these entrepreneurs and understand their needs and make sure that they're making these investments, albeit small, that allow them to still grow their business, that are not predatory in nature when it comes to rates, and allows them to have flexible return, knowing that we are deeply committed to paying off our debts. It's just a cultural belief. In addition to that, microlenders need to figure out, in lieu of an alternative credit score, how can they positively support and promote that business? How can they provide letters of reference? How can they support them via their social media platforms? How can they make connections amongst their consumer base so that their both financial capital grows, their business grows, and their social capital grows? So again, it's really just little steps of really connecting the dots. And to Nancy's point, being in relation and not having everything be transactional, but being relational and recognizing if I can help one entrepreneur, I truly can lift an entire community by the multiplier effect that Black and brown entrepreneurs tend to create in their own communities.
Awesome. Thank you, Melissa. This has been an exceptional panel. I'm so glad that you were all able to join me today, the Good People panel. I want us to wrap up by offering each of you an opportunity to present a call to action to a different industry of people, and also any last words that you will have before turning it back over to me. So Spencer, I'm gonna put you out there first. We started with you. Could you give a call to action to policymakers and any last words that you might have?
Sure. To keep it just very simple and straightforward, the big point is designing systems around BIPoC small business owners, right? So as opposed to designing systems for somebody else and then just trying to fit business owners of color in there, designing systems around these business owners. So what that means is, in addition to actually implementing that Dodd-Frank data collection requirement I talked about, policymakers should strengthen CDFIs in the next COVID relief package by appropriating emergency grants to CDFIs. They should make permanent and expand the 7A Community Advantage pilot program, including expanding the program to include disadvantaged business owners of color, regardless of their physical location, right? They should also expand and strengthen the microloan program by lifting loan limits, but also at the same time ensure that all SBA programs and offices prioritize serving underserved communities. Policymakers should also restructure the Paycheck Protection Program by adjusting the fee structure to give lenders greater incentives to make small loans. They should allow CDFIs to become more CDFIs to become PPP lenders. They should streamline the small loan forgiveness process, and they should also set aside new funding rounds for small disadvantaged business owners.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Spencer. Nancy, I'm coming straight to you. A call to action for philanthropic partners and investors, and any last words that you would have for us today.
You got it. I usually do this with the hand clapping emojis, but here we go. Balancing the scales of economic justice should be our means to combat racial injustice, right? And to do that, philanthropy needs to stop making people of color prove that we are worthy of investment. Assume we are. Assume we are capable, and assume that when we get the dollars that we say we need, we can deploy it. The other thing I will say is traditional methods of giving and investing have only scratched the surface in our communities. We have no choice but to innovate. But the only way to innovate is to give us the capital that we need, to have the breathing room, to make a mistake sometimes, because they will happen, but also allow us to go hyper local. And going hyper local means the way we measure things, you're going to look different in different communities. So put the word trust in trust philanthropy and trust communities with the risk capital that they need, and stop making us prove that we're worthy of investment. And in the end, you'll be able to build an ecosystem of investment in communities where profits from loans get reinvested right back into the community. But we cannot do that until the investments are made, and they're made in a real substantive way. So stop making us prove we're worthy of investment, assume we're worthy of investment, and then measure that appropriately.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Melissa, in the last minute that we have, I want you to speak directly to business service providers and entrepreneurs of color. What is the call to action for us, and what are your final words?
So I'm going to do that, and I'm going to add another call to action, because I have been following social media while we're on this. I think to business owners, and particularly business owners of color, know your worth. Do not allow the structural racism and the systems we have to operate in every single day determine your value. We know we are economic drivers of this country. We have been since we have arrived. Do not allow our history to hold us back, but allow us to propel and continue our resilience and demonstrate the economic contributions that we have made to this country and still continue to make to this country every single day. I have a call to action, though, to all the naysayers who've been on social media and who've spoken badly about us and about the foundation. I have a quote for you. It says, "Fear has two meanings. It could either mean forget everything and run, or face everything and rise." I challenge us as a country to face everything and rise. Greg, you talked about a quote earlier that America is currently foregoing an estimated 1.1 million businesses owned by people of color because of discrimination. These businesses that are not being supported could provide an estimated 9 million more jobs and boost our national economy by a minimum of $300 billion. The jobs number today is one of the highest of job unemployment provided in the past several years. We have got to stop thinking about race and being bound by our racism, and think about the betterment of this country. Is it allowing contributions from every single citizen? And while we all do not look alike, we have the right to be here, and we have the power to really allow us to maintain our economic prowess in this world that is currently being suppressed by individual racism and by systemic racism. And we must stop, we must face it, and we must rise.
Good people, that's our time. Thank you for joining us for this RF Breakthrough Series, Changing the Landscape Through Access to Capital. Unfortunately, we did not mention all of the great questions that came in. We will direct your reply after the live stream. Until then, good people, be safe and be well.